Corporate Finance Core Topic 10, International Corporate Finance, Learning Objective Number 3. Learn how to forecast FX rates using PPP, which is Purchasing Power Parity, IRP, which is Interest Rate Parity, and UFR, which is Unbiased Forward Rates. So inflation, interest rates, and exchange rates. So let's talk about PPP, Purchasing Power Parity. It is a theory that states that exchange rates must adjust to inflation differentials to prevent arbitrage in goods, where arbitrage is buying in one country where they are cheap, where a good is cheap, and selling it where it's expensive. So let's do an example. Suppose the spot price of the euro is $1.30. So what that means is the price to buy or sell a euro today is $1.30. Inflation in the US is 10%, and inflation in Europe is 4% over some period of time. Now, if the exchange rates don't change and US has 10% inflation and Europe has 4% inflation, European goods just got 6% cheaper for Americans. Or you can say that US goods just got 6% more expensive for Europeans. So the PPP theory says that in order to prevent arbitrage, the exchange rate would have to adjust so that the relative prices are unchanged after inflation. So effectively, if the euro had 6% less inflation than the US, the euro would have to appreciate by 6% to offset that. And so from an American's perspective, it costs the same amount to buy European goods. Yes, the goods are 6% cheaper, but their currency is roughly 6% more expensive. So let's look at the formula used to do that. It says that the new exchange rate, we'll call it E at time T, and I just put a notation. We'll call it currency H over currency F, right? That's your base, or your quote currency over your base currency. So that new exchange rate is today's exchange rate times the ratio of 1 plus the inflation rate in currency H over 1 plus the inflation rate in currency F to the T power. So we'll talk about, say, 1 year. So let's apply that formula. The new exchange rate in 1 year is $1.30, the exchange rate today. This is dollar price of a euro, so just make sure you have 1 plus the dollar inflation over 1 plus the euro inflation. 1.1 divided by 1.04. So $1.30 multiplied times that ratio of 1.1 over 1.014 is 1.37. Now, if you just calculate the appreciation of the currency, that is roughly a 6% appreciation of the euro, going from 130 to 137.5. Not exactly, but close. So what just happened here? PPP is suggesting that the euro needs to appreciate by 6% to offset a 6% less inflation in the euro. Otherwise, there'd be arbitrage in goods. The other way of thinking about how this happens in practice, if the inflation actually did happen and European goods got cheaper, there'll be a lot of incentives for Americans to sell their dollars, buy euros, and buy European goods. Well, that practice of just buying euros all the time from Americans, selling dollars, buying euros to buy their cheap goods, is going to bid up the price of the euro. So that's the way you can think about it, as kind of the mechanism for how this happens. All right, let's do an indirect quote. Suppose the Polish zloty is quoted in indirect terms at 3 zloty per dollar. Inflation in the US is 3%, and inflation in Poland is 7%. So what's happening is US goods are getting 4% cheaper, or Polish goods are getting 7% more expensive. So how would the exchange rate adjust to eliminate that differential? Well, the dollar, since it has lower inflation, is going to appreciate by that difference. Or you can think of the zloty as roughly going to depreciate by that difference. So let's do the mathematics of this. The new exchange rate is today's exchange rate, 3 zloty per dollar, times the ratio of 1 plus the zloty inflation over 1 plus the US inflation, 1.07 divided by 1.03. So the new exchange rate is 3.12. 3.12 zloty per dollar. So let's think about what happened. After the relative inflation levels, U.S. goods are 4% cheaper. and Polish goods are 7% more expensive. So in reaction to that, the exchange rate, the dollar, is going to appreciate by about 4%, and the zloty, not exactly, but pretty close, is going to depreciate by about 4%. So the equation is basically ensuring that the currency is offsetting the changes in inflation. Another way of thinking about it is high inflation is going to, if two countries, if you compare their inflation levels, the one with the higher inflation is going to devalue, the one with the lower inflation is going to appreciate by roughly the difference. And last, or another model we're going to talk about is interest rate parity. So interest rate parity looks like the exact same formula. It's the new exchange rate is the old exchange rate times a ratio, and instead of inflation levels, it is interest rates of that maturity. So you're looking for a 1-year forecast on the dollar per euro exchange rate. Instead of doing 1 plus inflation levels in the ratio for the two countries, just use interest rates. And the theory comes from this. It starts with the idea of PPP, but then it says that, well, if there's no arbitrage in bonds, in other words, bond prices ensure that there's no arbitrage because it'll ensure that real interest rates are the same in countries, then interest rates should only reflect differences in inflation and credit risk. So again, all investors are trying to get the highest real rate of return possible. And you would think in equilibrium, two countries like the EU and the US, their bonds would have the same real rate of return. Otherwise, there'd be incentives for arbitrageurs to buy the country that has the higher interest rates. And if you make the further assumption that differences, or that leads to the idea that differences in interest rates on countries' bonds really just reflect differences in inflation levels, then you could just substitute R for F. R for inflation levels. Now, this formula only works when you're talking about countries with this roughly the same credit risk. You can't say that Zimbabwe bonds and European bonds have this, their differences in interest rates only reflect inflation. No, they reflect differences in inflation and the risk that one of those areas is going to default. So we're only going to apply this model to countries with the same roughly credit risk. So it's generally the developed nations that we're going to look at, the ones with very little risk of defaulting. Also notice, again, this is the T power, so we wanted to know what happens to the exchange rate 5 years from now. We can just take the 5-year interest rate to the 5th power, 5-year yield to maturity on the government bonds to the 5th power. And also these these forecasts are also called no arbitrage forward prices. Okay, so either using the PPP model or the IRP model. So let's do a little example. You can go to the spreadsheet, but let me just explain what's going on in the spreadsheet. We have today's exchange rate, $1.10 per euro and 107 yen per dollar. US interest rates are 1.69%, European interest rates are negative 0.5%, and Japanese interest rates are negative 0.25%. So these are the sovereign rates on the rates on their sovereign federal bonds. So what is the expected euro dollar interest rate in 1 year? So that's the EUR USD. That would be the dollar price of the euro. So that's going to be equal to today's price, $1.10. That's $1.10 per euro times 1 plus the dollar interest rate, 1.0169, over 1 plus the euro interest rate, 1 minus 0.005. And that's going to be 112. So the exchange rate is going to go from 110 to 112. So that's going to be roughly a little bit less than, say, a 2% appreciation of the euro. And let's think about why that's the case. Again, US interest rates are 169 and euro are negative 0.5. That difference is about a little over 2-point-something%. So again, the theory behind interest rate parity is that differences in interest rates reflect differences in inflation. So what it's really saying is the US has roughly 2% higher inflation than euro. So what's happening here is the euro is appreciating by 2% and the dollar is depreciating by about 2%. Now for the JPY, I'll just put in my equation, today's price, 107 yen per dollar, times yen over dollar interest rates. So that's 1 plus a minus 0.0025 over 1 plus 0.0169. And that gives you a number of 104.96 yen per dollar. So what this is showing you is, again, US interest rates are 1.69, yen interest rates are negative 0.25. So again, we'll just call it a 2% difference. US has 2% higher interest rates, and which by IRP means they must have 2% higher inflation. So the yen price of a dollar is going from 107 to 105, roughly. So that's about a 2% devaluation of the dollar, right? Because the yen price of a dollar is the price of $1. So the dollar is going down by about 2%, which means the yen is going up by about 2%. And the last model is unbiased forward rate. Another way to get an exchange rate is to not use any formulas. You just call banks or Google rates that banks are willing to use for transactions in the future. So that would be called a forward rate. And so I can call my bank and I'd say, I want to exchange 1,000 euros. How many dollars will you give me a year from now? And they give you that number. That's called a forward rate. You can go to a Bloomberg or Reuters system and get a kind of a composite of those forward rates for banks at different deliveries. And you can use those as forecasts of exchange rates. Those have been shown to be unbiased predictors of future exchange rates or spot rates in the future. So in this topic, we talked about FX rate forecasting using PPP, purchasing power parity, IRP, interest rate parity, and UFR, unbiased forward rate.